When it comes to Zelda games, there is no doubt that the dungeons is the coolest, most fun and exciting aspect about them. And we are going to look at the best of the best.
The thing is, our plan was to make a top 10 of all the dungeons in the series, but we ended up with 10 3D dungeons on the list, and it's simply because we feel that the third dimension helps making the dungeon so much better and enjoyable.
But fear not, because we will make a top 10 2D dungeons video sometime in the future as well.
The dungeons have existed ever since the first Zelda game for the NES, and Four Swords and Four Swords Adventures are sort of the only exception, as they have different stages and levels. Some levels are dungeons, but they're not all too different from regular stages, other than being inside a, well, dungeon.
And whenever we play a Zelda game, we always look forward to these. To explore the different environments, experience the atmosphere, solve challenging puzzles, fight tough enemies, and generally, just have a lot of fun doing all this.
We also have to make it clear that we don't count the bosses at all in these dungeons, unless they play a certain role outside the boss room. Also, no final dungeons here, because those will appear on their own list.
We had to divide this list into 2 videos, because there's just so many things to talk about when it comes to dungeons. And we feel that one video with this would be a bit too long for our, and maybe your liking as well.
So, let us not stall this any longer, and just go ahead with our list. We're the Owners of Triforce, I'm Owner 2.
And I am Owner 1, and let us show you our top 10 3D dungeons in the Zelda series.
For our number 10 dungeon, we are going sky high in the world of Twilight Princess, to visit the city in the sky.
Just by saying its name, City in the Sky, you already know that you're in for something unique in a Zelda game. This isn't the first dungeon that takes place in the sky, but it's not often that you visit a floating city either, and especially by being shot out of a cannon.
With this dungeon being placed in the sky, you do experience a great atmosphere. There's a lot of outdoor and indoor areas, and it's outside especially that you feel this atmosphere to the fullest.
While being on this floating city, you see clouds all around, there's a strong wind blowing from time to time, and the music feels very airy and skyish, if you can call it that. Say from the Uka sounds, of course.
The Uka is sort of the only real downside to this dungeon. Well, the Uka story, anyway. We always found it so weird that these effed up creatures are what inhabit this great city. The city itself has a pretty special but cool design, and it has definitely required some advanced engineering, seeing as there are propellers that lets it hover in the air.
What's really interesting is that in the beginning of the dungeon there's a shop. It's not really common to have that in the Zelda dungeon, but it makes sense when you remind yourself that this is supposed to be a city for the Uka.
All weird Uka stuff aside, the dungeon has a somewhat complex structure, with some backtracking to discover new places that were unreachable before, which we find to be a positive thing.
One of the reasons why some places were unreachable was because of the second claw shot you get in this game and inside this dungeon, which means that you can grab onto a target on a wall or in the ceiling and hang there to find a new target to grab onto quickly. Even cooler is how you already can go higher and lower while hanging from the ceiling.
After getting the absolutely awesome double claw shot, you'll mostly use that item for the rest of the dungeon, as many of the puzzles and pathways require the use of both of them. However, before you get the second one, this dungeon does require a lot of use with other items as well.
The iron boots will help you from getting blown away by wind from fans. The bone arrow is useful to hit switches and shoot enemies. The spinner is used on an occasion or two. The gale boomerang is also useful against some enemies. The wolf form is necessary at some points, and even the Uka prove useful with gliding around.
The combat is another thing that's sort of disappointing here, because you don't really get to fight a lot of tough enemies, except for the aerial foss. Most enemies are these helmosaurs and birds and plants.
But one last really cool thing we need to mention here is the boss. Like we said in the intro, we don't count bosses as part of the dungeon in a list like this, unless they have something to do outside the boss room, which Argorok definitely does.
At the very beginning, you see Argorok come flying in, causing fear to the Uka. Later, he even destroys one of the bridges connecting one of the wings to the central building, which means he actually is a huge hindrance in the dungeon as well, other than just being an enemy you fight at the end.
In addition to all this, it was awesome how you could just look up and see him flying high above the city. It even helps creating an atmosphere, and it's so cool how you just ascend to the top to take the big beast down. This might come as a surprise.
know this dungeon is many people's favorite, and it's arguably one of the best dungeons in the whole series. While we can see why people love this dungeon that much, we don't find it as enjoyable as most others.
We feel the entry from our Majora's Mask dungeon ranking was lazily done, so we will sort of justify the dungeon here. I said that what made this dungeon was the ability to flip it upside down. We still stand by this, but I also said that the place would be really dull if it wasn't for that mechanic. That is not entirely true.
The place isn't dull. It has a pretty cool design, and we like how it's placed way up high in a mountain, or a tower, whatever. The outside structure is also very special, and it gives this place a mysterious feel to it.
Mystery is sort of a keyword to us here, as there is so much cryptic depth to the backstory of this temple, and even the whole Iconic Kingdom. Even though we have actually had some trouble understanding this whole situation behind the lore of the Icona region, we do appreciate that the dungeon has some backstory.
Even though most dungeons take place only inside a huge building, we always appreciate it when some parts of the dungeon take place in outdoor areas as well. The Stone Tower Temple has a lot of rooms without a roof, which we find pretty cool. We feel it gives more life to the environment around us.
When it comes to the music, we do feel that there are other themes that fit more with their respective dungeons. But there is no doubt that this theme is very enjoyable to hear, so there's no way that we'll ever get bothered by it.
What we can get bothered by, however, are some of the puzzles. The Elegy of Emptiness is a song that helps you create statues of Link's own form, or any other mass transformation forms. So, there are puzzles based on this mechanic, and the most annoying ones are definitely the ones where you have to use the statues to press down switches.
This was already tiring on your way to the dungeon, and when you have to do it inside as well, it'll get pretty annoying, and especially if you're as clumsy as us and forget to switch masks to create a statue, and end up moving the one you have already created.
Then, of course, there's this light reflecting puzzle. It's not annoying by itself, but when you have those freaking black bows respawning as quickly as they do, we end up getting pretty frustrated.
While this dungeon offers a lot of variety to puzzles and challenges, not to mention elements like lava, water, and flowers that require you to use all 3 transformation masks, we do find this dungeon a bit tedious to go through. It is challenging, but not always in a very fun and exciting way, to be honest. And especially if you go after the stray fairies as well, because then there will be a lot of backtracking, including going outside to flip the dungeon, maybe even multiple times.
In addition to different masks, you also use a lot of different items as well, so the dungeon offers a lot of variety. In addition, you will get the light arrows, which is the key item to flip the place upside down, which is still the best and most innovative thing about this whole place. What's great about it is that a lot of the rooms will be completely different, in addition to some that will stay sort of the same, and a lot new pathways will open up.
It's always nice to see things hang upside down, and the most special thing is definitely that you can look down to see the stars in the sky, which is a really unique thing. This dungeon is very innovative, it's got a lot of challenge, but we just find many other dungeons to be more enjoyable and somewhat better in different aspects.
Going to the Great Sea, we find the only dungeon from Wind Waker that appears on our list. After collecting the 3 pearls, a huge tower arises from the water, and you can now go in and explore the Tower of the Gods.
It's an awesome sight just to see this dungeon emerge from the sea while water keeps pouring out of it. The building is so huge that you can see it from almost any distance on the ocean.
We get a feeling of being inside a holy place the second we enter this tower. The design and architecture of this dungeon really creates a sacred atmosphere, and the music definitely does a good job complementing that.
One of the first things to see inside this place is this judgmental face, as if a god looks upon you with an unforgiving look, which you will continue on seeing throughout this dungeon. The pillars and pretty much everything about the architecture of this place look a lot like architecture from ancient Rome or Greece, and we like how there are a lot of glowing light around this place.
Now, when it comes to the actual gameplay in this dungeon, you start off with the lowest floor, where there's water. We think it's really cool you need to cruise around with the King of Red Lions unless you want to drown. The water level here keeps raising and lowering with intervals, and makes so that you need timing in order to reach places and solve puzzles.
When you're done on the first floor, you can start ascending this gigantic tower, and you'll have to go through some clever and fun puzzles with 3 different statues. What made this fun is that you control these statues either by having them follow you, or control them directly with the command melody that you learn inside this dungeon.
You have to control them into the room in the middle, and there are obstacles all over these paths, which make it sort of challenging and fun. What's really cool is that when you get all the statues into the central room, you don't just open up a door that leads to a staircase. What appears is a pink light that pulls you up. which adds to the feeling of being inside a place that belongs to gods.
What might be a downside to many is that there's quite a bit of platforming here, but we don't find it to be bad at all. There's also good use of items here, like bombs, which you have to use both with the boat and good timing with the water. But you also get the bow inside here, which is required to shoot at big open ice around places, in addition to destroying those damn beamos.
It's really cool when you keep ascending that you also go outside and up a staircase to reach the boss, who's a powerful force at the top of this godly tower. And it's a nice touch how we climb to the very top after the boss is defeated, and ring a bell to reveal the pathway down to the overflown land of Hyrule.
With fun puzzles based on timing and controlling statues, and godly symbolism and atmosphere, not to mention that this place was made to test the courage of a potential hero, the Tower of the Gods takes our 8th spot. What appears next on our list is something we didn't really know would be a dungeon when we first entered it. So, when we first took our step into this place, we knew we would be in for something unique. We're of course talking about the sand ship in Skyward Sword.
We just think it's really freaking cool that the ship we were helping Skipper to get back turned out to be the next dungeon we would venture through. The sand ship belonged to Skipper and his crew, but had now been captured by pirates.
And we can see how this ship has become sort of pirate themed, with hostages locked up in a brig and a cool looking pirate mini-boss. Not that it's really pirate themed or anything, but we love how this ship sails in sand. Water. Sand water. I don't know, there's water in the past and sand in the present, and it seems to sail pretty well in both.
Speaking of past and present, this dungeon utilizes the timeshift stones that we see throughout the Lanayru region and the mining facility. But this time around, there's only one of them in the whole dungeon, and the time travel will take place over the whole ship rather than just small parts.
You enter the place in the present, and the whole ship seems really desolate. There aren't many visible threats, but it still feels kind of eerie to be aboard. Everything is very colorless, and it looks very old, which it really is, but it also looks sad.
When you hit the timeshift stone, that's when everything comes to life. Everything will look more colorful, enemies will spawn, hindrances come and disappear, and the music becomes more pleasant. While there are nice things happening, more threats also appear when you go back in time.
The way to reach the timeshift stone is by use of the bow and arrow that you get inside here. What's sort of disappointing is that you fight the mini-boss and get the item incredibly early here. And the bow and arrow is pretty much the only item you'll use for the rest of the dungeon. However, they still made pretty good use of it, by shooting enemies and solve puzzles by hitting targets, not to mention the timeshift stone, so it is used in very good and fun ways.
There are so many places you could shoot the timeshift stone from, and it helps makes the puzzles more challenging and fun to do. What impresses us is that, from the outside, the dungeon looks pretty small. It might not really be, compared to other dungeons in the series, since we can rarely see the whole dungeon or area at once, but we still think they did a great job packing this ship up with content.
We like the whole structure of the ship, and of course that you get to be both on deck and inside the ship. It's got good complexity with many different ways to get around places, and some puzzles really require you to think what pathways you can and cannot go, based on what time it is.
The sand ship is a great dungeon. It sort of looks small, but it's filled with content and clever puzzles, especially with the timeshift stone. We like that it's a ship and that it sails on sand and or water, and the way to reach it, it's also really cool. The dungeon starts out being invisible, and you have to find it by shooting cannonballs while dowsing for it. What's really sad, but also cool at the same time, is that the boss actually destroys the ship in the end.
We've been talking a lot about horror themes with counting Redeads and Stalfos as two of the coolest enemies in the series, and even praised the bottom of the well as one of our favorite or best mini dungeons. With our love for the sudden creepy and horrific stuff in what's usually a fun and bright adventure, we will of course add the Shadow Temple onto this list.
The Shadow Temple is a place that she calls the House of the Dead. And she's not kidding, because this place is behind the Kakariko graveyard and does house a lot of evil and scary creatures and themes.
The place belongs to the Sheikah, with Impa being the sage of the temple. There are a lot of theories about what this place really is, if it's a prison, a training ground for the Sheikah, or just a place to keep all evil from the land of Hyrule. One thing is for certain though, as we take a direct quote from one of the odd paintings inside, Shadow Temple. Here is gathered Hyrule's bloody history of greed and hatred.
Which really shows. Inside we find the darkest and most horrific dungeon in the series. Inside plays the same music as in the bottom of the well, but there's no doubt that the theme fits very well here too. In the music you can hear moans and screams that make us believe come from the tormented souls that have gone through a lot inside this place, to say the least.
There is reason for us to believe that people have undergone a lot of punishment here because of all the different torture and execution devices you find inside this place, like the guillotines, swinging statues with scythes, and something resembling an Iron Maiden. There's even blood spilled around. This would also explain all the undead enemies like the Redeads, Gibdos, Wall and Floor Masters, Stowfalls, Bubbles, etc.
Which brings us over to the gameplay of the dungeon. This place might be linear, but it contains all kinds of traps and somewhat cryptic puzzles that make the place a bit more complicated. There's a lot of enemies, walls and traps that are invisible, and there are a lot of fake walls and floors. And that's where the lens of truth comes in. We find this item brilliant and fun to use, as it creates a vision that can see through lies and deception.
The item you get inside of this place is the pair of hover boots, which allows you to hover for a second or two if you walk off a ledge. It's really helpful here, since there often are big gaps you have to get across, but also because you might make it back to safe ground, if you're quick enough to notice that you start hovering when you think you're walking on a static floor, when it's just trickery.
There's also a good variety to the use of items. You don't only need the lens of truth and the hover boots, but the hookshot is necessary to reach different places. The bow and arrow can prove useful to defeat enemies and solve puzzles, bombs are necessary, and the iron boots help you from getting blown away by fans here and there.
Even though this place has some really good puzzles with good items, there's also a lot of emphasis on enemies and traps. This is one of those dungeons that has danger around every corner, and it's just built the way we feel it should be. One time or another, you are going to get hurt.
There's even more symbolism with a very strange ship towards the end. One of the paintings says that the ship will take you to the other side, as if it was taking people or creatures from the world of the living to the other side, where all the dead are being brought. That is an awesome way to close in the dungeon with.
For its puzzles with unique items, for its backstories or theories it creates, and especially for the creepy imagery, themes, enemies, music, design and structure that creates a horrific atmosphere, the Shadow Temple ends up on 6th place of our 10 best dungeons from the series, and we still haven't seen anything that comes close to this in comparison.